Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the Native Vote 2016 post-election webinar. We want to start today's webinar by reviewing a few housekeeping items and making sure that you know how you're able to engage with us throughout today's webinar. We're looking right now at an example on the next slide here, at an example of what the viewer interface looks like. This is what you should be able to see in front of you currently. As you will see, there's a presenter panel on the left where you will see our slides as we're flipping through them, and there's an audio control panel and participant panel on the right. So what we're going to do now is zoom into the control panel and make sure that you're familiar with all of the functions there. So first, by clicking this orange arrow, you can pop your control panel in and out and effectively hide it so that you can see today's presentation. From the view menu, you can also set the control panel not to auto-hide when inactive, if that's how you would prefer. Within the audio pane, this is where all of your audio information is, and by default, you have joined this webinar via mic and speakers, although you are welcome to use your telephone. So you can click this button here to do your audio setup, and if you opt to use your telephone, there will be a number that is displayed for you with an access code, and it's very important that you enter your unique audio PIN. You may also raise your hand at any point during the presentation, and we will do our best to respond to your questions through the chat function. So here's where the chat box is currently, and you can enter a question to the staff who are helping run this webinar today. We will have a Q&A session at the end of our presentation, and this webinar is recorded, and we will be sending out a link to those who are participating in this webinar and for those who registered, and we'll have it available on our NCAI YouTube page. So thank you for your time and attention. Please do send us a note via the chat box if there are any issues that arise. We look forward to sharing some exciting information with you today. Thank you. So first up for our election webinar, we have President Brian Clattersby for the National Congress of American Indians. Go ahead, Brian. Thank you.
President Clattersby? Hey. President Clattersby, if you hear me, you are on mute. You've self-muted. You need to unmute yourself on the button.
All righty, how's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
All righty, we'll try it again. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're at. Welcome to NCAI's post-election webinar. I am, my traditional name is Speed Potts, and I am president of NCAI, and we want to thank you for taking time out of your schedules today to be here with us as we discuss the recent election. I think it is safe to say that not only Indian country and not only the U.S., but maybe the world is surprised by the results of the election on Tuesday. I've heard from a lot of tribal leaders and others across Indian country wondering what a Trump presidency will mean for Indian country. And I think the reason for that concern has been the unknown. When presidential transitions occur, we usually have had some experiences with the candidates or have had some idea of their record on tribal issues because most presidents have come from positions of governing. With President-elect Trump, all we know of his record on tribal issues are statements made in the 1990s from a gaming hearing. So this is an especially important time to have this discussion about what we have learned from this election, the part that Native Vote played in certain states, and what to expect as we transition to the new presidency and Congress. But I'm going to ask my fellow tribal leaders, tribal representatives, and other participants is this. Number one, we are sovereign tribal governments. As such, we have been through many transitions of elected officials and public policies. Some have been favorable and others were intended to restrict or remove our self-determination. Every administration in Congress has priorities that are consistent with tribal priorities. So on those issues, we can come together and make as much progress as possible. And of course, other policies are not as favorable for tribes. Likewise, on those we come together to educate, inform, and make sure that we are not harmed. This administration and Congress will be no different, and it is why I'm pleased to be president of NCAI during this transition. NCAI's role has always been to bring Indian country together, and transitions have always been a time for us to come together to set priorities and goals for the next 4 years. And all of us at NCAI look forward to your partnership as we carry out that work, and we'll be sharing with you our transition and what we hope to achieve in the next 60 or so days before the President-elect Donald Trump is sworn in. So with that, I will turn it back to my staff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Clattesley. I'd like to start this webinar by going through the agenda. We will talk a little bit about the purpose of the webinar, the presidential overview, trends in the national election, congressional overview, dealing with the House and the Senate outcomes, key state elections, voter protection, and Native candidate results, which we'll welcome Mark Trahan to also join us in the webinar. What's next? What are the opportunities and challenges and transition and upcoming events? And of course, we'll end with a question and answer period, which will give you more instructions on the question and answers when we get to that. So let's go ahead and get started. And our first slide is the slide on the Electoral College and the popular vote. As you know, Trump won the Electoral College with 306 electoral votes compared to the 232 for Clinton. And eventually, and I say eventually, Clinton will win the popular vote by a 1 to 2 percentage points, somewhere between 1.5 million to 2 million votes, once all those mail-in votes and ballots come in from primarily California and Washington are counted, along with all the provisional ballots that are still out there in the states. Each election teaches us something about where this country is as a whole. In this election, the main themes that came across was there was a need for a change to status quo, and that's really about what they call about the insiders, Washington, D.C. insiders versus the outsiders. And overall, there was this concern about jobs, the economy, a real economic security issue that seemed to really resonate with voters. And with his victory on Tuesday, Trump enters the presidency with the most consolidated power since 1928. Now let me explain to you what I mean by that. The Republicans will control the White House. They will control the House of Representatives, control the Senate, and control most of the states' governorships, at least 33 states. And they will have the ability to pick the Supreme Court nominees and replacements, at least one. The last time Republicans controlled both the executive and the legislative branches was in 2007. I want to also say one more thing about this popular versus electoral vote. It's interesting that when you look at the overall national elections, and this morning I was in a press conference on something else with the civil rights communities, and I said that I felt like when I analyzed this election that there was a lot of disenfranchised voters. And I'm not just talking about disenfranchised voters that, when they go to the polling places and exercise their right to vote. Certainly that is a concern we'll talk about a little bit later under voter protection. But those that were disenfranchised with their government, who didn't feel like their government was representing them. And so that created either strong passions about who they were going to vote for, and you saw that in a lot of the aggressiveness in the campaigns, or a lot of apathy. And you saw that in the numbers of who didn't turn out to vote. So when you look at nationally the elections, in presidential elections, voter turnout, in 2000, it was 55.3. And then there was a steadily between 2000 and 2012, you know, we were in the low 60s to the high 58s. 2016, this election, we were at a 56.6% turnout. So which is just slightly higher than 2000, but clearly not high enough compared to the last 3 elections. And what's interesting when you look at that and why this makes a difference is Trump won this election with less votes than McCain lost in 2008. And that's significant. And we'll talk about that a little bit more also when we move into, you know, what does that mean for Native vote turnout and the numbers of Native vote turnout. The other thing is, so with that, you know, of course, in the last five elections, twice, the popular vote was different than the electoral vote. And so that brings this question, and both times it's been a Democrat who's been at the losing end of that challenge. And so it brings about the conversation about, well, does the Electoral College matter? And what does it mean for us? If you looked at the next slide, we'll be talking a little bit about the Electoral College, but as I get there, I want to say that, so in this conversations, and I was listening to another pollster this morning talking about this, and we got to remember that the Electoral College was created to make sure that all parts of America were represented so that it wasn't totally blocked by the large urban centers, that they weren't the ones that were making the decisions solely, that there was balance in America having to deal with the rural and more remote parts of America. And it's something that we're going to have to, I'm sure America's going to take a look at. There will be lots of conversations, but we need to remember that there was a balancing act to Electoral College. And, you know, does it properly represent your vote today is a question that people are bringing up, and I just wanted to make sure that I laid that out as one of the issues that I think will be coming up as we talk about elections and potential election reforms in the future. So if you see this map, it shows the Electoral College as part of the reservation boundaries. In fact, Amber did a great job about putting reservations in there so you can kind of see where we overlap with some of those votes. Trump gained more than 270 electoral votes by flipping several states that President Obama had won in 2008 and 2012, including Iowa, Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. There was a razor-thin margin in the terms of the Electoral College. The polls missed the popular vote by about 2 points, which flipped Iowa, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania from Clinton to Trump. And the popular vote moved 2 points. If the popular vote moved 2 points, the results in the Electoral College would be reversed. So I'm going to bring that point up when we talk a little bit about the Midwest. The polls significantly missed the support for Trump among whites without a college degree in the industrial Midwest. And I'm going to talk about the polls. The state polls missed the voting preferences of white voters without college degrees who went strongly for Trump. I was at this event this morning where there were a number of pollsters talking about what happened in the polls. And it was interesting that they said a couple of things. One is that polls try to make you feel comfortable about what you already know. And primarily polls are used in campaigns to identify where resources should go, especially when there's limited resources. But he said, it was interesting, he used this quote, and I want to say, it fails to provide certainty to an uncertain event. And certainly this election was an uncertain event. And for a long time, people will talk about what went wrong in the polling, whether it was the access issue because of cell phones and hard lines, whether it was, you know, reaching more to the younger generation versus the older generation, but clearly, but one of the factors in this particular election is something that they call like the lean-in factor, and that is people were not talking about who they were going to vote for. Whether they decided when they got actually to the voting booth or they just weren't ready to be socially responsible or socially admit that they, who they were voting for. And so those created a lot of changes in the polls. The other part of this poll was that it really underestimated the large support of the Hispanic population, such in areas such as New Mexico. So with this next slide, you'll see trends in the presidential level about gender and education, urban and rural. It's always kind of interesting to look at these different trend lines, and most importantly, this election was a lot about women. We heard it on both sides of the campaign, whether it be, voting for the very first woman that potentially would be a president versus, other issues about concerns of women and treatment of women. And so looking at the women turnout, there's 24 percentage points American men. Women preferred Clinton by 12 points, which is probably not surprising, while men preferred Trump by 12 points. At this 24-point gap could be the largest split in gender since the 1950s, which is really interesting that there was such a large split in gender when we turned out to vote. Women's voting preferences haven't shifted much since the time when they preferred Obama by 11 points. However, men swung heavily Republican by the largest exit polls. In 2012, men preferred Mitt Romney by 7 points, and this year they preferred Trump by almost double that. So that's a huge swing just in gender, which is interesting for this election. When we look at the next slide, which talks more about the education gap in presidential preferences, and in 2016 election, there was a wide gap in presidential preferences emerged between those with and without a college degree. This by far is the widest gap in support among college graduates and non-college graduates in exit polls dating back to the 1980s. Among whites, Trump won an overwhelming share of those without a college degree, and among white college graduates, a group that many identified as key for a potential Clinton victory, Trump outperformed Clinton by a narrow 4-point margin. Trump's margin among whites without a college degree is the largest among any candidate in exit polls since 1980. And there's a massive fissure between college and non-college educated whites. Romney won non-college educated whites by 26% points, and according to polling data, currently exit polls show Trump's margin among that group to be roughly 1.5 times that. The white share of the electorate declined by 2 points to 70%. Trump won America's racial majority in a landslide, taking college-educated whites by a margin of 53 to 43%, and the non-college educated by 72 to 23. So this latter margin was especially significant. As of this time, Clinton retains a narrow advantage in the popular vote, but the non-college educated whites make up a disproportionate share of population in the Midwestern swing states, which they call the Rust Belt, that provided Trump his decisive educational majority. As you can see, education was a major factor in this election. Now let's move to the next slide, which is this impact, which I think is actually one of the most critical areas. As I said earlier, I felt that this election was about disenfranchised voters. But I will say that at the core of that is this issue of economic security. And economic security has been, and the economy has been a factor in probably the last 6+ presidential elections, but clearly was a factor here. One of the winning messages, of course, from Trump was being able to let people reminisce again about Make America Great Again, and what would that really look like in that economic security. So when we look at the possible impact of economic security, it's places that voted for Trump are under greater economic stress. Just look at where manufacturing has moved away from, where jobs are challenging. In fact, I heard somebody else today say, drive through America. Drive through America and drive through those places, and you will see why they felt there was a pressure for change, particularly with economic security. Trump is seen as the job creator and job opportunity in those areas. Places that swung toward Trump are those where jobs were most under threat, those routine jobs that are easiest to automate or to send offshore. Another factor in this election really is the discussion of trade and trade policies. Trump was strongest in places where people are most concerned about what the future will mean for their jobs, even if those aren't the places where economic conditions are worse today. So, so those are important pieces that you'll see as part of education, economic security, are also important in Indian country and in our tribal communities, and certainly are factors in the turnout of Native vote. I want to turn right now to a little bit of looking at the U.S. Senate. You can see this picture here is the party control at the beginning of the 115th Congress, and Democrats make up, anyway, in the Senate, Democrats made gains in the Senate. I want to make that clear. But Republicans didn't flip any Senate seats. Democrats flipped 2 Senate seats. Tammy Duckworth in Illinois defeated the incumbent, and Maggie Hassan, I want to say that right? She defeated the incumbent. Sorry. And the incumbent, Kelly Ayotte lost and conceded today. There's only one real shocker. When it comes to the Senate races, that Hassan beats Ayotte, and I want to say that right, by less than 1,000 votes. In New Hampshire, the spread of votes is within 20%. A candidate can demand a recount, but Ayotte conceded today. Catherine Cortez Masto holds retiring Senate Harry Reid seat in Nevada, which is a Democratic seat. She's a Democrat. And the Senate Democrats increasingly become more diverse and better reflective of the U.S. population overall. And especially going back to Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada. She actually came, if you remember, she came to NCAI last year here to our offices to meet with us to learn more about Indian country. And it's important when candidates choose to do that. Tells that they know that they want to message to their constituency base. On the U.S. House of Representatives, you'll see that Republicans make gains in the House, and Paul Ryan attributes Republican success to races to what he wanted to say, riding on the coattails of Trump. Party turnover in Florida, Nevada, and Virginia happened. And the number of women in Congress declined by 2. And Democrats, interesting though, in the House, Democrats flipped 6 seats in a presidential election year that went for a Republican. So it's also clear that there's not a mandate that Democrats are still making gains in the in Congress, and that even though the presidential election was a big deal, there's still a lot of diversity happening in the states. But one thing that's important is that when we look at the Congress, you'll see that the best pipeline to Congress is really to run for a state legislature. And in fact, somebody had said that when Democrats learn that the pathway to Congress is through state legislatures, we can focus more on what's happening at home in the states. So that quickly turns me over to what happened to the Native state legislators in the 2016 election. Next slide, please. So the pre-election numbers, we had 72 Native state legislators in 19 states. Post-election, we have 67 state legislators in 21 states. So we have less Native state legislators, but we gained in the states that we have representation in. You'll see the numbers: 60 are Democrats, 7 are Republicans. 9 of the 67 are newly elected. 2 states with Native legislators are new state legislators are Oregon and Wyoming. And 4 Native women won seats in Minnesota. I just want to put a little side note. I bet you Peggy Flanagan had some influence there. And 9 Native state legislator candidates won seats from reservations and urban districts in Montana. Montana usually does pretty good, and their Native state legislators, I know they've gone up and down, and we'll talk a little bit more about Montana as we go through this webinar. So Native vote in key states. So when we look at this one, I just wanted to focus just for a minute on Michigan and Wisconsin, because they were clearly the battleground surprise state when people were watching the election results that night. And, you know, a couple days before the election happened, I was going through our Native vote states and where we had Native votes, and I noticed I was kind of nervous because these were key states and we didn't seem to have, you know, organized Native vote efforts as many, and I was a little nervous about that. But in the 2 closest states, Michigan, the Native voter population is 7 times larger than the vote margin. And in Wisconsin, the Native vote population is 3 times the vote margin. So what that really says is that even though we don't have a lot of information about Native vote turnout in these states, it demonstrates over and over again that when Indian country engages, the Native population can play a key role in really close elections. These were really close elections, and Native votes can make those differences. The other thing is, if you remember some of the Native vote webinars we did earlier, we showed that primarily Natives, our Native vote votes as blocks when we turn out. And so it's really important to make sure that we turn out and because in those small, when the margins are tight, we can really make a bigger difference. And looking at the turnout here in Montana, overall in Glacier County, home to the Blackfeet reservations, the turnout increased about 7 points over 2008 and 2012 presidential elections. Roosevelt County, where Fort Peck is, a turnout increased by 3 points. So great turnout for those counties. Overall, Montana voter turnout for all voters was 73%, which is a lot higher. Once again, going back to the national average of being about 56%, you know, Montana with a turnout at 73, and was one of those states that was an early count too. So tribal turnout was slightly less than the overall turnout. And of course, I think that we can attribute that to a lot of the work that Denise Juneau did as a Native candidate running. And even though she didn't win her office, there's no doubt in my mind that she certainly stepped up the Native vote turnout and made a difference within her state with turnout. Except for Crow, voter turnout for all the other Montana tribal precincts was roughly equal to the turnout in 2012 for other counties or higher. So congratulations to Montana for the effort that you guys did there. I want to turn to Alaska, not because it's my home state, because it's also a place to look where there's a high percentage of Native votes. And it's always important to see what Native vote does. And they have made differences in past elections. You know, clearly Lisa Murkowski continues to attribute Native vote support to one of her winning factors. But in Alaska, it seems that the Native vote turnout has actually fallen a little bit. And I'm just looking at in the Bethel area, for example, the turnout fell from 61% in 2012 to 38%. Now, I'm not sure yet because we still don't have all of the early votes counted and in to see whether or not, because there's a huge campaign in Alaska always to vote early and to vote absentee, to see what that really looks like. But it's kind of surprising given that in Alaska, one of the ballot initiatives was having to deal with the permanent fund and how that, the permanent fund system, and I know that means a lot to Alaska Natives, so I wanted to share that information. And it's important for us to do these and to analyze these votes and voter turnout because all we can do is improve from election to election and how important it is to have stability and making sure Native vote doesn't happen only during the election cycle or presidential cycle so we can continue to move on. So I want to go to the next slide, which is the issues, the national issues. Okay, so some of the on voter protection. So couple of the things I wanted to mention here is this was the first election without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. You know, NCAI has been an advocate of getting the Voting Rights Act passed in Congress. It still hasn't passed in Congress. We've had good support for the Native provisions. We had a great team. I want to give a shout out to the Native Vote Protection Coalition. Great team who worked really hard on the issues, making sure state by state that the issues were dealt with early and before the election happened, and making sure that on-site things were being addressed. So that coalition effort is alive and well. But in the larger coalition with the civil rights groups, they are in the larger group with the Native vote, with the civil rights groups. You know, they're taking a stock at what happened in this election. And they're counting the challenges where there are issues. So, for example, there are 868 fewer places to vote in 2016 because of the loss of the covered states provision in the old Voting Rights Act. And that includes Arizona, Texas, North Carolina. 14 states had new voter restrictions put in place for the very first time in 2016, including some critical swing states like Wisconsin and Virginia. And in North Carolina, the black turnout decreased by 16% during the first week of the early voting. And in 40 heavily black counties, there were 158 fewer early polling places. Also in North Carolina, there was a huge number of votes that were purged out of the system the day before the election. So what's happening with the voter protection, the civil rights organizations are tracking these issues. They will do a full report to Congress. Congress is the one that can make a determination. They're still going to push for the Voting Rights Act to happen during the lame duck session. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's possible during the lame duck session. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit of what we learned from voter protection. I want to go to the voter protection successes, and that is, you'll see in Nevada, next slide please. In Nevada, as a result of the Pyramid Lake and Walker River Paiute successful lawsuit against the state, Native voter turnout was dramatically amplified for the first time ever with an increased access to new satellite voting places. There were major increases in Native voter turnout for Reno Sparks Indian Colony as well, and the DOJ monitors were present in Mineral and Washoe counties. Heavily contested races, it was great to be able to see that. In Arizona, the Arizona Voter Protection Hotline assisted over 80 voters and field volunteers on 12 reservations. And the GOTV efforts contacted 9,500 Native voters leading up to the election to make sure that they understood what their rights were. And in Montana, Western Native Voice had approximately 57 field volunteers covering any 10 key areas of the reservations. This is just an example of some of the key issues, the key successes with our voter protection. And once again, I want to just thank again that Native Vote Coalition for the fine work that they did. At this point, I'm going to turn our slides over, time over to Mark Trahant. You know, any of you who follow Mark Trahant on our any of your social media can just tell you he is the person who is tracking, particularly at the local level, the candidates, the Native candidates, and he's going to give the Native candidate report. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Jackie. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry I'm late. I actually had to teach a class. This was a fascinating election in a lot of ways, and it really started with incredible optimism because just the sheer number of the candidates and traveling with a great number of them. The thing that struck me from the very beginning was how much quality. Folks that had resumes that were unparalleled in terms of elected office, just ready for not just to run, but to get elected and to govern. We can go to the next slide. Did you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Continue on.
Okay. So back up one slide. Okay. So three things that I kind of picked up right away, and that started with the talent, and that is we got to get more people to run. That there are too many places across the country. In fact, 31 of the Native American candidates for legislatures ran unopposed, and only 5 seats that were Native versus Native candidates had people running on both sides. And I think that's kind of the bipartisan message is we need to just get more candidates and to take a chance and to run and to get them on the ballot and just get them to have this kind of conversation that needs to occur. Part of the problem is the challenge of money. And I haven't gone into a deep analysis yet, but just the back of the envelope calculation shows that in this particular election, money didn't make a whole lot of difference. Victoria Steele, who was running Seneca was running in Arizona's 2nd congressional district, and she was kind of running a shirt tail operation, not a lot of resources, and yet she did really well up to the primary. Denise Juneau had more money than any Native woman candidate, certainly, but most Native candidates, and yet she did about 40% of the vote. Chase Iron Eyes had virtually no money and really learned kind of the whole process as it was unfolding, and yet outpolled all of the Democrats pretty much running statewide in North Dakota. So it opened up a little opportunity. With legislative candidates, of course, there is just a growing opportunity because it doesn't take nearly as much money to run for Congress. It just allows you to get in and kind of experiment and learn on the job. 2 things I want to mention about the congressional race before I move on, and we can just look at that slide real quick. Maybe? Okay. So we had 5 candidates that made the final. We had 9 at one point before the primary. The range in money and the range of experience. Joe Pacotis would have been the first tribal leader elected to Congress, which I think opens up a whole new career path. The second one is that, particularly in the case of Denise and Chase, just watch what happens over the next few weeks. If either of the candidates that defeated them end up taking a job in the administration, they're ready to go. And there could be a snap campaign that allows them to kind of come in a back door, which is something that happens throughout history. So it'll be interesting to watch and see if that opportunity. Kevin Kramer, who beat Chase Iron Eyes, is definitely talking about going into the administration in some form or another, either possibly as a Secretary of Energy or just something along those lines. And if that opens, no matter who they run in North Dakota, Chase would have voter name ID, and in a off-cycle election, that could be significant. Next slide. So I mentioned we had 31 legislators running unopposed, and to me that's unfortunate. It's fortunate for them because the first vote in, they're winning. but it's unfortunate that we don't get to build the infrastructure and to get the conversation going in the way that would be most useful over the long haul. And we go next slide. So this year did have a race, though, where you had Native American candidates running, representing both parties. And one of the candidates who lost was Bruce Meyers, and he's a Republican running in Montana. But he actually made the case to the Republican Central Committee in Montana that Native issues had to be more front and center. And he was able to get the party to have a conversation that it might not normally have had. And that's the kind of thinking we need to go across the board, is to get folks on both sides to think, how can we open up this process to others? And he was defeated by Frank Smith, who had been in the legislature before. This is one of those districts that are designed to pick up as many Native votes as possible. So it stretches from really from Rocky Boy all the way through Fort Peck. So it's a huge geographic district, and it really puts pressure on those two reservations to kind of elect one of their own, and that's where some of that was reflected. So we had 5 candidates who were Native versus Native, and I think it just opened up the conversation in a different way. Next one. So one thing that came through in this election, particularly in Montana, but also in New Mexico, is that coal was really on the ballot. Looking at districts such as, and we can go to the next slide, Roosevelt County is a great example of this. Roosevelt County in 2012 was overwhelmingly for Obama, and it shifted pretty dramatically. Let's see, in 2012, Obama had 56% of the vote, and Romney had 41%. And you can see this time it was 49-42. And one of the conversations in that district was coal, and whether or not coal could come back as a resource. And a lot of folks that have their income based on that were certainly talking about that. That also, if you look at San Juan County, New Mexico, had a similar discussion. And also around the Crow areas, Bighorn County in Montana had a similar discussion. It's one of those ones where it's kind of interesting, because even though the political discussion was pro or against coal, what's missing from that is just the sheer what's going to happen with the markets. And that's a very different discussion, but it kind of got missed in that nuance in that particular race. Next slide. So one of the real success stories is folks who figured out how to win in really deep red spots. And Paulette Jordan had a really vicious Facebook campaign against her, and direct mail campaign. It was funded by the National Rifle Association and one of the offshoots, and it just basically was along the lines of, she'll take your guns away. And I think what mitigated that was Paulette just worked really hard and got into several of the communities that where she was able to take her message directly to the people of Idaho and saying, no, that's not, I'm a gun owner myself, and it's not. In fact, she was in the legislature supporting a measure that supported sheriffs controlling or supporting extra gun rights, and yet that got turned around in these really nasty mailers trying to be have her be anti-Second Amendment. The other thing that helped Paulette's success is working hard to get students from the University of Idaho to support her campaign. And I think that's one of the messages that needs to be told, particularly to young people, is that unlike most citizens, they have a choice about where to vote. They can vote in the home community if that's going to be more useful, or they can vote on campus if that's more useful. They really can be strategic about it. And perhaps that's one of the areas where we can get through to help folks think about strategic voting and what are the opportunities. And go to the next one. And so I have a little different list than the National Conference of State Legislators, but I think one of the most important stories coming out of this election in several states is urban Native representation. Before this election, I would argue that urban American Indians and Alaska Natives have less representation than anybody else, just because of the 2/3 of our population lives in cities, and yet we didn't think of them in the same electoral context. But the success this time around is pretty stunning. Of course, Peggy Flanagan plan on getting people excited in Minnesota, and as Jackie mentioned, 4 getting elected. But also 2 in Montana. Both Garrett Lankford and Shane Morgeau ran just spectacular campaigns and really made it clear they'd be representing everybody. And I think that's a great message for folks to hear. And go to the next one. So, and I couldn't put this chart, this chart is one that works best if you actually have it online because it's interactive. And what it allows you to do is you click on the state, you can actually then see how many have in that state. And basically it just links to the spreadsheet. And my spreadsheet, the raw data I'm using is just below there. And that is also either on my site at Turnout Reports or on Google, either one you can get it. And since that was published, I just got a call this morning that I missed somebody in Oklahoma, so I'm going to update that later today. But that's the nice thing of these spreadsheets is you can update them in real time. Good representation growth in several states. We really had a shot at parity this time around in 7 states. And I'm going to have to crunch the numbers, but I think we're going to be at 4 states where there's at least the same percentage in the population as there are in the legislature. And part of the reason for that is Idaho and Wyoming, the numbers are just so small that 1%, that one person in the legislature bumps the percentages a little bit. And then looking forward, again, going back to you got to run to win. The opportunity in some of these states is continuing to grow. The one that just eludes me, and I actually had a conversation with one of the political parties' campaign office, is the Arizona 2nd Congressional District, or Arizona 1st Congressional District. This district is 22% Native American and growing at 2% per 2 years. So every cycle it's going to be more and more Native. And it just seems to me that this is one where both parties ought to be investing in candidates and looking for the long term. This is where they can make the demography match the parties what they say they want to do. And that district alone is probably going to shift. It's just a question of when and whether it's going to be with resources. One of the really striking things about the U.S. system compared to Canada is that Canada, when you win a Liberal Party nomination or NDP, the party then invests money in you. And here, when our candidates get to that point and they decide to run, Joe Pacoda said he got a phone call from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and they told him, great, now raise $500,000, and then we'll talk to you. So it's just the opposite. Here you got to raise the money first before they invest in you. Whereas in other countries, when you get to this point, they start thinking through investment. North Dakota, I think, is still an opportunity, even though it didn't turn out that way this time around. New Mexico, particularly the 1st District, is an opportunity. And Don Young in Alaska has said he wants to be replaced by an Alaska Native. And the numbers keep growing in that direction. It's just a question of when and the right candidate and the right coalition. But I think it's definitely down the road. Next one. Or is that it? And I think that's it. And I'd be happy to answer questions. One of the great things this time around was I got to travel with a lot of the candidates, and some of the stories are just really remarkable. 2 quick ones I'll tell is you could see the growth of the candidates running statewide in North Dakota, and there were 3. And at the beginning, it was hesitant and not really working well on the road and trying to just fight their way through it. But by the end of the campaign, you could see them just relishing it and working with the groups they were talking to and being able to figure out what issues were going to get the most response and honing their messages. And I think a lot of this is just practice. And when you see that practice happen over time, it's pretty encouraging.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And we will take questions at the end.
Okay.
So we really appreciate, of course, the True Hunt reports, and I look forward to seeing it pop up on my email all the time. So thank you for your continued dedication. We really, really appreciate that. Moving on with the presentation now. what is this? What's the big picture? What is this election? What's the agenda? What's the priorities that we really see? And as I said earlier, when voters went to the polls, it really was about economic security. It was about those things that were close to them, that makes a difference to them. And of course, you'll see some of the messages that resonated were those that are job creators and address some of those issues. So on Trump's agenda, obviously, is infrastructure. And it's interesting that infrastructure was on, as I said, many other of the presidential candidates' lists. So you see a common thread of the need for America's declining infrastructure to be addressed. It also is a jobs creator. And even though I said earlier that, actually I'm not sure if I said it to you guys or not, but because I said it to someplace else, but even though that the Congress has already passed the transportation bill, which is a huge infrastructure bill, there still probably will be an appetite for an infrastructure bill. And people wonder, well, how are we going to pay for it? Because an infrastructure bill, especially if you look at the Trump proposal, it's $5 trillion to do the infrastructure. How do we pay for that? And whether or not that will be paid for out of some kind of a tax structure or whether that will be borrowed. And it's interesting that one of the questions that was asked at another event that I was at this morning, which is how much appetite does American public have for the deficit? And when you look at the deficit, Bush increased the deficit, Obama increased the deficit, and it doesn't seem to really matter with American public. It's a matter of how you actually package it and what do they get for that deficit. So people outside of the Beltway are probably less concerned about the deficit than those that are inside, you know, the congressional monitors and those of the deficit. So that's interesting. And, you know, the Republicans are all saying we're willing to work together. We want to work together. And infrastructure is one of those places they can work together. Another area is trade. And you saw that a lot in, and we'll get later into the 100-day, Donald Trump 100-day plan. But trade is a big issue. It deals with jobs being taken overseas. And it also, it was a big campaign issue of Bernie Sanders. He got a lot of folks who are really concerned about trade and trade policies that impact America's economy. I expect that that will be in the discussion and something that will happen along those lines. I heard someplace else from one of the pollsters that made a comment saying something about, well, how can this be high on Trump's list when, you know, he manufactures a lot of his projects overseas, and you certainly saw that in a lot of the campaign material that was there. And the response from that campaign is basically, it's the policies that create that environment that it's only economically feasible to go offshore. And so looking at those policies is one of the answers to that. We all know that healthcare has been one of the conversations in the Republican, whether it be Congress or a presidential candidate. So healthcare is expected to be one of the first things that gets taken up by Congress with support from the president-elect. The new version of the ACA is actually called the Better Way. And the Better Way doesn't have a lot of substance right now. No one can really speak to what's really in it or not in it at this time. There'll be a lot of conversations as they move forward, but it's expected to be one of the early bills in Congress that gets introduced and to move quickly on the Better Way. I did ask a technical expert that's has been part of the conversation with ACA and the Better Way, and was wondering what does that do for the federally delivered healthcare services like IHS, Veterans, and Department of Defense healthcare. And it was his best guess that in the mishmash of creating the Better Way and dealing with the tougher issues, that those federal healthcare programs will probably be not affected. And I just made it very clear that we didn't want to be part of the collateral damage of whatever may happen in that conversation. And that's something that, and as well as all of us, need to work with National Indian Health Board to be able to make sure that we're prepared early with good statements, good education, because that is one of the areas that we want to make sure that Congress is well prepared. It's expected that when they come to Congress, they'll want to show that they're actually getting something done, and getting something done means picking up the ACA, whether it be, whatever form of repeal, rechange, or redraft that will take. So that's a couple of those things. And then, of course, we all are looking to see what will happen in the lame duck, and everybody's reading the tea leaves on what we know. And so Denise, our policy director here, has been having close connections with folks on the Hill, and we know that there will be a National Defense Authorization Act, but we also know that McCain's guiding that, and it will not be a piggyback under his watch. So he's holding tight to what will be in that NDAA, and that's going to be important. We are looking for vehicles for ensuring that the VOCA funds, the Victim of Crime Act funds, gets taken care of. And we have strong bipartisan support on this effort, strong Republican support. So we're looking for a strategy of addressing that, whether it be an approach or something else. When we look to the spending bills, however, we were earlier hoping that there would be an omnibus bill. It gives us a little bit more latitude to deal with things like VOCA funding and possibly even the Tribal Labor Sovereignty Act. But what the current thought of what we're hearing from Congress right now is, earlier Ryan had said that he was from the House, and the House leads a lot with budget strategy, says that they were going to be doing mini omnibuses. That doesn't look as likely right now. Right now the conversation tends to be just CR, continuing resolution. That's always problematic for Indian country, continuing resolutions, because there's only a certain percentage of what we get, the funds that are important to continuing our governmental services and programs, but also we lose the opportunity for any enhancements to those programs and that may have come in any budget proposals. So we're concerned about that. It depends what that CR looks like. We know an incoming president will want to take some time to analyze the budgets. And on that note, the Tribal Budget Advisory Committee met from BIA met this last week, and they've determined that they were going to have a special meeting early in February, in conjunction with our Executive Council winter session, so that they can get a better handle on where we are at with the budget and budget negotiation pieces. So spending bills are going to be an important piece to us. I want to remind folks too, when we talk about spending bills, and we really are not sure what the Trump administration will come out with for Indian country. We saw a lot of budget increases in the Obama administration, and more so as they learned more about Indian country and the needs of Indian country. We know that there's going to be an educational curve, which is going to be important. But I want to remind folks that we have strong supporters on appropriations in the Congress. Our strongest supporters have been Republican leadership, and we've been able to get greater gains with the leadership in Congress, and we're going to look to them to help sustain where we are. We have, one of the persons that was reelected, of course, was Tom Cole from Oklahoma. He's been a champion, and in his very brief statement that he issued when he won his reelection, two of the things that he put in that statement, out of the brief statement, was one, I continue to support Indian country and their issues, and two, protect the sovereignty of tribes. So champions like that are going to be champions that we're going to need to count on. I'm looking at also the early priorities for the Congress. I said earlier, healthcare will be one of the things that they will deal with probably right away, if not the first week, clearly as soon as they can. There's the energy bills that we got so far on with the Senate and the House. Whether that gets done in the lame duck is yet to be determined, but if not, they're right to be something to be considered as early priorities. Energy also tends to be a priority of the Trump campaign and their contract for America. We'll talk about that in a minute when we get more to that. Cybersecurity, that tends to be an important issue. There's the concerns of the Russia, issues, but there's also, it tends to be a vehicle to continue to also bring up, Clinton and the emails and keep that conversation alive. Economy, when we talk about economy, we're talking about things like tax reform. I think tax reform will be something that Ryan has said it will be important, that they actually believe that they're going to push forward is tax reform. And I want to say that those are places that Indian country really has something. Infrastructure, healthcare, tax reform, all of those places, including national security, border security, are places where Indian country really, really has messages and needs to have a visible place at the table on. And so NCAI, as we always do, we're looking for these winning opportunities to be able to make sure that we can push our agenda, and also looking for those challenges that we need to be ready for and prepared for. And that takes me to the next piece. Many of you may or may not have seen yet Donald Trump's contract with America Voter. And this document kind of gives you an insight to what the 100-day plan looks like for the Trump administration. There were some key things in there, for example, like things that are beyond the presidential authority, like term limits. Mitch McConnell made a statement saying that elections are the term limits, and that took place when we showed up to the polls on Tuesday. But there was other things that are out there, like getting rid of federal regulations, and certainly like getting rid of executive orders that are things that I think we need to pay attention to see what regulations he's talking about, what executive orders. When he was talking about executive orders, he was talking about those that were unconstitutional. We need to figure out what that definition of unconstitutional is versus reminding ourselves that tribes are part of the Constitution and what that looks like. But, clearly when you look in here at some of the good actions, that the action around infrastructure is important. It costs a lot of money, but those are things that Trump's really good at. He's a businessman. He's used to building big things. He knows what that takes. He's built big buildings, he's built bridges, and so that's something that he knows a lot about. And then, of course, some of the concerns he mentions in here, the Keystone Pipeline, but likely I think that will impact DAPL too. And I had an earlier conversation with Standing Rock, just to get a sense of where we are. Our message is still the same. We want to push for, asking for the no easement, the denial of the easement, and continue to have the monitoring that needs to happen by DOJ. It's important that that denial of the easement happen. And so, but if you look at these areas, what I'd call areas of departure from Indian country, Keystone, DAPL, likely DAPL, and, unconstitutional executive actions or memorandums, those are important. The Supreme Court nominees, it's a matter of what Congress's appetite is. I know there's going to be a push from the civil rights community to deal, as I said, with the Voting Rights Act and the Supreme Court nominee. Clearly Republicans will be able to make that choice. But once again, when you look at what the makeup of Congress and in the Senate, no action can happen without support of the Democrats. You still have to get to 60 votes, and they need support of Democrats to make things happen. I talked about the repeal of the ACA already, but states will, there's a lot of states' rights conversation if you look in not only this document, but, and I think that's a place for us to make sure that we push hard on tribal parity. So that's not just states' rights, but it actually is, you know, when you talk about local governments, you're also talking about tribal governments. And it's important for us to have strong education from that. A real concerning piece in this document, of course, is the withdrawal from the UN climate change activities and the resources to fund those climate change activities. The trade-off of that is that's how he sees funding infrastructure to be. So whether infrastructure that could support climate change could be used, I'm not sure. But obviously, you know, fixing infrastructure and water in Indian country is important. Local control and community control over education is something that Indian country's been advocating for a long time. The whole issue about creating jobs, vocational and technical educational programs is important to Indian country, as well as affordable child care and elder care. Reducing violent crimes, dismantling gang activities, certainly anything that could also be tied to things like opioid epidemic. All of those can help advance some of our narrative around local control, jurisdictional, trying to think about some of the asks that we put forward in the tribal law enforcement reauthorization bill, thinking about those things. Healthcare and treatment for our veterans, another thing that's really important for us. And then just investments in roads and telecom infrastructure could be part of this Energy and Infrastructure Act. And then depending upon, it'll also be important for us to gauge where we are around the energy pieces, and then because, you know, if you remember at the beginning of the Obama administration, we said Indian country has 15% of the energy resources available, and we still haven't tapped those energy resources, whether they be alternative energies or traditional energy resources, and that will be important for us to be included in those conversations. I want to go now to the next slide, which is the transition slide. Everybody's been asking, what about the transition? It's interesting that when you look at the elections, the Clinton campaign was really geared towards a lot of preparing for the transition. And nobody could fault anybody for doing that, obviously, because it takes more than the 60 days they have available to, you know, have a transition of the largest government in the, you know, in the world, and to have a peaceful transfer of power takes a lot of work. You know, whether they were quiet about it, there wasn't a lot of conversation about the Trump readiness for transition, but clearly they have stepped up. You'll see here a slide of the Trump transition team. Just want to note that when you look to the interior transition, those of you who have been with us on trust reform for eons ago, that kind of dates some of us. What? During Secretary Norton's time period, and we were doing a lot of the trust reform negotiations before we got the Cobell settlement. David Bernhardt was very much a part of those activities, and he is on the transition team for Department of Interior, and certainly is a friend to many people in Indian country and has a good working knowledge of Indian country. So that gives us some reassurance in that. I know that there's also a group of Native Americans who have come out to be the Native Americans for Trump during the campaign. A lot of people that we all know well and have some good solid leadership, and I'm sure that they will continue to influence and be part of influencers in the Trump transition team and in the Trump administration. I want to clarify that Trump has met with Native Americans, that he has met with many Native Americans across the country, whether they be part of the team that was created for the campaign for Trump, but others. And it'll be important that that those folks who have the power to be able to help educate. Because if you get to the next slide, I want to show you some of the names that are being floated for some of the positions that are important to us. And some of these, you know how it's like in any election and transition. You get a whole bunch of names that for some drop off really quickly, but usually one or two of these names hang around, and they are usually the ones that are selected. So even though this list looks long, that doesn't mean anything. It just means that these are names that are being floated along. And as you look at this list, you'll see some of them are familiar, like familiar names from Congress, from Murkowski and Crapo, Bishop, Inhofe, others. Some of them are governors or past governors, and you'll see the list from there. And then, of course, there's names from the industry, particularly from the oil industry, energy industry. So you'll see them on the list. And it's and what NCAI will do is continue to monitor the list, try to be able to have some input, and some of these names have good familiarity with Indian country, and would be, and others don't have as much. And so that's why having conversations with those that can influence would be very important for us as we look at the transition, the names in the transition. The next slide actually takes you to some of the other names for some of the key agencies. Of course, you heard the Attorney General, names floated like Rudy Giuliani and Chris Christie and Jeff Sessions. All of them, some of them still targeted to whether or not, having to deal with the Clinton emails and what does that look like. But you'll see that, some of his names reoccurring in various places. Names like Ben Carson, who turned out in the whole election campaign to be someone that a lot of folks could really rally with. I actually sat next to somebody on the plane one time that was part of his campaign and talked a lot about Native American issues. So seeing him in a couple of places here is not surprising at all. Would be a likely candidate for some consideration somewhere. But I have to once again, I want to say how important it is for us to have Native Americans in the administration. I remember in the Obama campaign and the Bush campaign and administrations, how difficult it is sometimes to get Native Americans to leave your home and to be able to come to Washington, D.C. for some time. And as it was told to me by Mary McNeil years and years ago, all you have to do is just come for 2 years, Jackie, and 2 years will make a big difference. Okay, so I'm out here, 18 years later, but it really does make a difference. Having people with real experience from our tribal communities being able to be the advocates within the administration is going to be important. And it's going to be clearly really important. And if you go to the next slide, it's going to be really important now because we don't know what this administration is going to be like. Trump is an outsider, so you don't really know about some of the things and how it's going to operate. We'll know a little bit more when you see how who really is the influencers in his policy. You'll be able to see we put together. We've been working on the recommendations that have come up from Indian country for transition recommendations, and we're prepared to work with the transition team to share those recommendations in the mechanisms that make sense to them. Clearly, the first thing that this administration is going to be doing is looking at those nominations, and we put forward a list of key positions that need to be filled in the first 100 days, and we'll be sharing that as broadly as we can with those in the transition team to target those. So I'm urging you that if you consider at all, make sure that you put your resume through the appropriate process that will come out. We'll share that information with you when the transition team releases it. Share your resume with us, and we will continue in the administration in every place that we can. It will just be so important. We've got so many gains with the Obama administration and so many things that are still in play that they aren't finished yet. And we need to be able to make sure that we have those folks that can shepherd those through and continue to move them forward. And those are the opportunities that we will continue to have to hold firm on our sovereignty, continue to push for policies of self-determination and that are critical for Indian country. It'll be really important for us to be united. This is going to be one time. I always say that when you're dealing with change, change always creates some level of fear or discomfort. Whether that change is good or bad, and I'm not saying that one way or another, all I'm saying is change creates that unknown factor. And the most important thing, when Indian country we can come together, we are really strong. We really make differences happen. And it will be important, not just with Congress, but with the administration, that we are very united. We're united in protecting Indian health care. We're united in making sure that we are at the table on infrastructure and jobs and making sure that when we talk about those programs and systems that go to local governments, that they're a governmental parity for tribes. There's a lot of places for us to have convergence, and we are seeking those. We'll be seeking those opportunities. Just a couple of other notes I just want to make slip. I just want to let you know that this doesn't stop with this webinar. These conversations will be ongoing as we move forward and prepare. We will have a meeting with on January 19th in conjunction with the inaugural festivities, as we have in the past. And this meeting is primarily for us to give you an update on what's happening with the transition. By then you'll have the names will probably have been narrowed down for the Department of Interior and a few other places. We'll have a better insight on what's going on and to be able to share that information with all of you. So please join us for that meeting if you can. And then we also have these other upcoming meetings that I just want to plug for you real quickly before we hit the questions. And that is the NIGA and NCAI Task Force is going to be meeting on November 29th here in DC at the NIGA offices. Our Budget Task Force meeting is going to be really important. The Budget Task Force meeting is the meeting that we have with all of the national organizations and regional organizations. They can call in or can video conference in or be here in person. It's going to be extremely important as we look to a new administration, get the intel that we can from folks like the Center of Budget and Policy and other budget forecasters to get an idea of what we can expect and how with the budget, but also the revenues that generate the budget, the tax policies that we might be, that might address those issues. And then, of course, we'll have our Executive Council winter session in February, the week of the 13th here in Washington, D.C., which is, as I said earlier, the TVIC will have a piggyback meeting in conjunction with that. Information, I really want to thank you guys for being on this webinar. And now I'm going to go to questions. I have a question here for Mark. Mark, you're still on the phone, right? And the question I have for you is, why didn't the state or national parties put money into the tribal races, or did they?
They did only when candidates reach threshold levels, and that's really standard operating procedure. They just don't have a system for investing in candidates. One of the things I'm really wrestling with my role is trying to figure out if there's a better way to get early money to candidates. And it's almost heartbreaking when you see some of these folks running who are giving up so much to get out there on the campaign trail and have virtually no resources. And we just don't have ordinary, I mean, one of the things Chase Iron-Knights was doing was selling T-shirts. And that's creative and wonderful, but that's not how we should run campaigns for Congress. We need to have a way of tapping resource for these folks and investing in them. And clearly the parties are not structured to make that work.
Oh, right. Yeah. Thank you, Mark. And that's true. That tends to be an issue all the time for Native candidates, is trying to get enough resources. And we know the parties, tend to, they're very strategic with the limited resources they have and dump the money into the states where they're either, challenged states or states that, really need those resources for moving that forward. Another question that's come is, do you see any changes in IHS under the Trump administration? And so far, the only word that we have or indicators that we have right now is more about the conversation, as I said earlier, the repeal of the ACA. the repeal of the ACA. We know that the House and the Senate, the Republicans have been very involved. I think at this time there's been 70 or 70 plus actions to try to repeal this ACA. I said earlier, I think clearly the Trump administration has weighed in on that. But I'm hoping that what I heard today is somewhat good news, but won't be good news without Indian country standing behind that, which is to make sure that these federal healthcare delivery programs don't get caught up in the mire with the other conversations about how do we reform Medicare, Medicaid expansion, those kinds of issues. As far as the legislative issues regarding any reform efforts, one thing I did hear very clearly, and we heard this from Larry Roberts at TBIC yesterday, that the administration got together. We heard that with Obama's, the conversation Obama had with Trump, that he's made it very clear he deeply respected how Bush left the administration for him, and that he wants that transfer of government to be as good as that or better. And they want to leave this in next administration with some game plans. Let them have the information that they need to be able to make wise decisions so that we don't have a large learning curve and that they can pick up the administration and move forward. I think this conversation about IHS is going to be one of the places that we'll want to make sure that within HHS there's some clear direction on how to address the IHS. So that would be my recommendation. I have another question that says, will the slides be made available? And yes, we will put the full webinar and the attachments will be posted to the website. As we said earlier, you can actually download the webinar and watch or listen to it later. Do I have any other questions? So I have another question, which is good, and this is a good question because people are asking, where do we send our resumes if we're interested in serving in the administration? We will actually post that information, send it out, but there are two places. You can send it to resumes@ncai.org, and then you can send it to greatagain. Greatagain.org. Those are to the Trump transition team and to NCAI. So we'll make sure that you have that information. But once again, it's resumes@ncai.org or greatagain.org. Okay. So there was two other questions that came in. What do we see in this transfer of this new administration? How does this impact ICWA or CABEL? So I'm going to attempt to, with ICWA, let's just start there. One of our concerns has always been, we worked really hard in this last administration, particularly with Department of Justice, to make sure that we had some state oversight and monitoring, which was important. You saw the regs that came out. Hopefully those won't be regs that will be repealed by the next administration. It'll be important for us to ensure that doesn't happen. But also I think that we do have an era where we felt some tensions of states' rights, and we want to be able to, once again, this is that message, making sure that states' rights doesn't impact things like ICWA, where tribes are providing these services that and carrying responsibilities that are so key and important to us. And then the other thing is the CABEL. So CABEL settlement, there's a couple of things that are still not resolved yet with the CABEL settlement. There was a process for that. There was some land into trust responsibilities, and there was also the education scholarship programs, buyback program. Those are in process, and I think once again these are areas that the administration has solid plans on. They have not met their goal, so that does create some significant concern. However, I tend to say, and I'm only saying this from my experience, and so this is not necessarily anything that, you know, I can say is concrete, but, you know, when a new administration comes in, and I've lived through a couple of them, I don't know, I've lived through a couple of them. When a new administration comes in, they hit the high point. They're going to want to get things that can really get moving for their agenda. We see a clear agenda on infrastructure, energy, jobs, you know, dealing with healthcare. Those are clear agendas. I'm, you know, supposing, or maybe I'm trying to have encouragement that those things that are just continuing to proceed on will proceed on. And the more that we can let them do that, the better off that we will be. You know, so we need to be strategic in Indian country. Where are the areas that we will bring up concerns versus where are the areas that we will allow them to move on? So, you know, the administration will continue to do their work as long as they can continue to do the work. And I'm hoping those things will happen. We also expect that there will be an oversight hearing in the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs on the Cabell settlement before the end of this month. So that's another touch point place for us. I do want to make sure that I did this wrong when I said this. I said the website for the Trump administration for resumes. It's greatagain.gov. That was my fault. So once again, it's greatagain.gov and resumes at ncai.org. All right. I have a question here about the impact of tribal consultation and Indian gaming. So, you know, when I talked about the Donald Trump's contract with American Voter, and there was a piece in there about, you know, repealing any executive orders that have constitutionality challenges. Once again, I said I'm not sure what that means as far as the definition, you know, that was used in this for constitutional. But I do think that, you know, I do think it's important that we saw, I think the consultation policy is important. Right now we're amidst some major consultations regarding the infrastructure permitting. That is clearly an important place for us. It's also going to be an important place if we're talking about large-scale infrastructure development in the next administration. It's an area that, you know, at NCAI, and we've had other webinars on this, that we've worked really hard, and we're going to continue to work very hard to make sure that there's solid, realistic recommendations that we can give this administration now, and that will continue to the next administration to get those done. So, you know, that is an area that we do need to pay attention to. We just really need to pay attention to. And consultation is key in that. Consultation has proven that it's a good working vehicle, and we want to be able to make sure that we continue that good working vehicle. And I believe that we can, that helps sell that itself. Concern about gaming, you know, Trump has made statements, and I'm sure this is one of the reasons why the person asked the question about gaming. From the 1990s, it was shared all through Indian country, you know, when he had his challenges in Atlanta and you know, was frustrated, blamed them on Indian gaming. It felt like Indian gaming was creating a competition. You know, that was Trump as a businessman. I just have to say that was Trump as a businessman. We still have to see what Trump as a president will be about. And it will be important for us to, you know, have that benefit of the doubt, continue to educate, push forward. You know, I think as you hear in the news, and many people have said things, we're not totally sure what Trump will show up, you know, how he will, you know, I thought his concession, I mean, I felt that his acceptance speech was, you know, was great, very reconciliatory when he said, we've got to unite America. We have to bring together. Now we have to, you know, the proof is in the pudding somewhat. We'll have to see how that happens. And clearly with Indian country, Trump as a president has a different responsibility than Trump as the businessman. And that's going to be important for us to keep that in mind. I have another question that says, how will Trump's presidency affect Tribal Advisory Committee? And I think that is the Tax Tribal Advisory Committee. Sorry, I was trying to get that whole question there. The Tax Tribal Advisory Committee. You got to remember, the Tax Tribal Advisory Committee was an act by Congress, and those appointments were made. Some were made by the administration, but some were made by Congress, and those appointments have been made. And so I think the Tax Tribal Advisory Committee will continue on. They have work to do. That was part of that effort. And so I'm hopeful that that happens. I'm feeling positive that that will happen. I think tax is going to be a big part of the agenda. And so I think it's going to be very, very important for this Tax Advisory Committee to get working. And it'll be important for us to keep our tax working groups working together. You know, the work that we do with NIGA and NAFOA and others on tax is going to be really important for us to stay together and make sure that we have a united recommendations moving forward. Is there other questions? Okay, so I think I've covered most of the questions. If not, and you feel like you need to ask another question, feel free to email us at NCAI. We'll be glad to give you any additional information. And as I said, this information, the webinar and the handouts, the PowerPoint will be posted to our website. Most importantly, I just want to thank again the leadership of NCAI. President Clattersby is an amazing leader and was first out, you know, during this election process. Not only was he texting me during the night, which is great, but first out talking about how important it is for us to get unified, how important it is for the country to come together and to be able to make sure that we encourage this mutual respect that needs to happen from peer-to-peer, person-to-person, government to government in all fronts. And if we keep that framework of mutual respect, then we will find a better place for coming together and to coalescing on the important things that are important for Indian country. This agenda of economic infrastructure, tax, are all important to Indian country. I also want to thank Mark Trahan, as I said earlier. You know, he is the guy, the watchdog, and watching state by state, the individual national races, native races, is just so important. It is the pipeline to Congress. We need to have more representation. Clearly, we're underrepresented, and the work that he does just makes it so much better as we step up. I have with that, I want to thank everybody and thank you for participating and listening to us today. Thank you particularly to my staff. Can I just say this? I got to say this because nobody knows what it takes to put this together. You know, the elections happens, everybody has an assignment and they watch all night, and then we come together yesterday to try to pull together everything that we can possibly learn to share with you a story for Indian country that you won't get in the national press because they don't write about Indian country. So I want to thank our staff for their dedication in making this happen. And I want to thank all the Native Vote coordinators across Indian country. You made it happen, and we appreciate you so much. So here's NCAI staff giving a round of applause to the Native Vote coordinators. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.